What are your views in general on fiat as money?
Well, there are huge advantages to the political class,
right?
Because they can produce it either in a direct way through fiscal policy or roundabout way through monetizing debt on the monetary side. And they can do all kinds of stuff with it. And a lot of times the price for doing that stuff is paid, a decade or two or even generations down the road. Mm-hmm. And so they benefit from buying votes in effect. So absolutely, fighting wars, there's all kinds of political benefits to fiat for the political class. For us, the turf for the gang members, it's all downside.
Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on the show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor based. So all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer.
Today's podcast is brought to you by In Wolf's Clothing. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times per year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that help fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. So go to wolfnyc.com to learn more about the program or apply. Again, that's Wolf NYC, WOLFNYC.com. Jeff Deist, welcome to the What is Money Show.
Thanks very much. Great to see you.
So good to have you. We met, I think, for the first time in Nashville, Tennessee at the Mises event. You gave a great speech on a book I believe you had recently written.
If you say so.
You were talking about a lot
of speeches. They're starting to run together.
Gotcha. It was a very insightful speech just on the nature of how politics have devolved recently, and the relationship to economics in general. By way of quick introduction, you spent a decade at the Mises Institute, and you are currently the general counsel at Monetary Metals. So a man very well studied in the field of economics and money. So I thought a natural first question for you, sir, would be the namesake of this show. What is money? What is the nature of money? And how do you explain this somewhat complicated topic to people that don't know anything about money?
Yeah, isn't that interesting how such a simple question ought to be a simple answer?
Uh-huh.
And in many ways it is. But I would say in the modern world, we've almost lost sight of what money is, because we tend to conflate money and debt and credit all into one amalgamation. That's can be disorienting. And of course, we have political money in this world. Mm-hmm. So I break money down in political money and market money. They're the 2 types of money. And they both work to an extent. You can go buy stuff with either one in a perfect world, but there's a huge difference. And so to me, money is simply the commodity that the marketplace decides is best used to facilitate trade. so that people don't have to resort to barter. We all know the problems with barter societies were poor societies. MMTers don't even admit that barter societies ever existed. So that's, I think, interesting. They think money was a creation of the state from day one. But nonetheless, we understand from Menger and Mises that money ought to be simply the most saleable commodity in any geographic area, and that we can determine that it has value in marginal utility. Menger gave us that the more money you have, the less each additional unit of money is worth. And that money has value because it had a pre-existing use as a commodity. That's what Mises says in his regression theory. And that solves this question of like, this circular question. Well, why does money have value? Because you can buy stuff with it. Well, why can you buy stuff with it? Because it has value. So Mises said we had to go back and solve that. We had to go back to its earlier use as a commodity. I don't think people should fall into the trap of saying that it has inherent value. Your gold has inherent value. So I don't think that's correct at all. Money is as subjective as any other economic good. And we as human beings imbue it with value. And so right now we all want $1 million or $10 million or whatever we want, or 10 million Bitcoins. But that's just because we assign it value. It doesn't have inherent value. If you're starving alone on an island and dying of thirst, piles of gold would be basically valueless to you. So we have to understand that value is contextual and subjective at all times. So Mises and Menger basically solved the problem of what money is in economics and made it a conceptual thing for us. There was obviously a big debate when Bitcoin was a baby back in the early 2010s about whether it satisfied Mises's regression theorem, whether we could go back and find a pre-existing use for it as a commodity. And I think there are lots of ways you can approach that. Much smarter people than me have written big, lengthy articles about that and say, well, it's tied up in the mathematics of it, the algorithm, it's tied up in the tech, it's tied up in the immutability, it's tied up in the novelty. You know, people forget that Bitcoin was novel at the beginning. Oh my gosh, I just traded 10,000 Bitcoin for a pizza, got it delivered. Whoops, you should have done that. But at any rate, I don't think we should get hung up on that, because at the end of the day, money is what the market says is money. That's so important. None of us know the future. None of us individually can decide that the future of money is Bitcoin. Oh, the future of money is gold because fiat currencies are going to collapse and everyone's going to go back to what they knew. And this and that. That's not up to any of us individually. That's a collective decision by markets, first and foremost. And that you can't overcome markets ultimately. Political money, which is my term for fiat money, created by government treasuries in coordination generally with their central banks, is an attempt to impose money by law, by fiat. And ultimately, I would argue that is a fool's game, and that the political pressures on political money will be too great to have it maintain its value. Because when we know what money is, and then we look back at Menger and Mises and say, well, what's its purpose? Its purpose is to help us overcome barter and to transmit value through time and space, give us a store of value. There's some very interesting questions I'm sure we'll get to with respect to gold versus Bitcoin on that question. So a medium of exchange, a store of value, pre-existing use, arises naturally on the marketplace as a commodity. These to me are the big elements of what money is. But today, Robert, we have shadow banking. Sounds sinister, but that's just like Rocket Mortgage. Rocket Mortgage is the biggest shadow banking institution on earth. It's not sinister. How much money have they created in effect? They've made it possible for a lot of people to buy houses. So that kind of looks like money. You get into M3, you get into M4, broader aspects of money. Our treasury bills today, almost a form of money, because they've enjoyed such great status and they've been that liquid for that long. What is money today has become very, very clouded. And because our whole money system is based on debt, as opposed to a shiny rock sitting there that's melted down into a coin with no counterparty, we blur the distinction between money and debt enormously in society. And so as a result of all this, you and I, we might be geeks and we like to go back and read books that Mises wrote in 1912. But we shouldn't be blaming normies for not wanting to have this conceptual or cerebral exercise. They just want to have some money, preferably more of it from their job. And they sure would like it if it covered their bills. And that gets harder and harder when gas is $4 or when bacon, you go to Walmart and look at a pound of bacon for us carnivore people, just unbelievable. And so average people may not be interested in the discussion that we're having, this definitional discussion. But I'll tell you what, they sense that something's wrong with the dollar. And I think that the fact that they sense that is going to have not just economic, but political ramifications.
Yes, many excellent points there. I guess we could say that market money is an emergent socioeconomic phenomenon, not decided by any group or individuals alone.
And I like
right? Yeah, it's like a social consensus, something kind of like language, right? It just sort of emerges. No one decides what words come into use or go out of use in language, just like no one decides which money is or which monetary good is promoted as money. I think this is to Minger's point, if I recall correctly, that every good exhibits some degree of moneyness. Right? Certain things are more saleable than other things, and the thing that is the most saleable is what we traditionally call money. Is it safe to say or proper to say that political money is kind of like the weaponization of money, or it's actually being used less as a tool and more as an instrument for control, manipulation, things like that, and that the politicization of money leads to its destruction typically, as we see in hyperinflations across history?
I think it's absolutely a weapon. Now, it may not have always had its origins in that, and there have been plenty of good, well-meaning, moral people involved in the U.S. monetary system, even on the political and central banking side since its inception, true believers who think they're doing the right thing and that, the government has to provide money. So I don't want to discount that. Sometimes we fall into this trap of viewing everyone as a devil. But nonetheless, in effect, yes, money is a weapon. And that doesn't really matter what kind of political money we're talking about. We're talking about the United States with the world's reserve currency for our dollar. That allows us to not only export inflation, but to boss the rest of the world around in our payment system, to pay for wars and boss them around militarily that we wouldn't otherwise be able to pay for through taxes. A whole host of ways that makes us the bully. If you look at the euro, I would argue that the ECB is a sort of a minor version of that. Money becomes a weapon in terms of foreign aid, in terms of debt. A lot of third world countries, or what we may call second world developing countries, are forced to borrow in dollars or euro, currencies they can't print up to repay. But even in a country that's not nearly as wealthy, we look at the terrible example of the former Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Its government basically weaponized currency and drove the population in penury with hyperinflation. We've seen that in Argentina more recently. Even today, the great cautionary tale that is the last few years in Turkey. My goodness, those poor people. The Turkish lira was basically 2-to-1 with the euro back around 2010. 2 lira to 1 euro. And Erdogan was saying, we're going to join the Eurozone. We're going to join the EU. And now fast forward, and I don't know what it is. It's been at least 20-to-1 in the last year or so. So, that Erdogan and some of his predecessors basically weaponized that currency against his own people in effect. And so I think any political tool, legislation, armies, courts, currency can absolutely be weaponized against ordinary people. It's just the nature of politics, which we would view as basically a proxy for war itself.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I heard it put that warfare is a function of fiat currency largely. I mean, at least not all warfare, but let's say World War I, World War II, the scale, scope, and severity of those conflicts would not be possible without fiat currency. So it's pretty clear that it's very much. I don't think it's an overstatement to call it a weaponization of money. So if we're looking at the most successful market money historically, which is gold, what are your views on gold as money? Is it something we can go back to? Is it something we need to go back to? If so, how? I mean, I kind of look at our current paradigm as the ultimate outcome of gold, because we needed to centralize its custody so we could scale its use. And then obviously the centralization of that custody led to central banking. Central banking led us to a global fiat standard. What are your views on gold as money as far as advantages, disadvantages, and is it something that we can ever make use of as money globally?
Well, we certainly could. And the digital apparatus we have makes the divisibility question much easier than in the past, where gold was only a physical thing. Well, it still is only a physical thing, but it could be represented digitally today, and thus, you sliced up however small you might want to buy a pack of gum or whatever it might be. We certainly could. I don't think we will. I don't think we will. Any Western country will ever return to a gold standard, absent some enormous calamity, which just created either the military conditions or a populist uprising of such ferocity that something like that was even possible. Now, whether the Eastern countries would ever consider it, or Russia, I mean, I think in some ways they'd like to. So I don't think we would or will, but we certainly could and should. One of the big criticisms of gold, and I think it's a valid one, was its weight and the difficulty in forging it around, and also the need to secure it in vaults, and the need to assay it to determine that it's real. It's 99.9% sure. All of those things lent themselves to centralized control of it, whether by big banks and then ultimately later by state treasuries and central banks. And so, that is definitely a problem with gold. It worked exceedingly well during that bright, shining period of unbelievable prosperity in the 1800s up until the early 1900s. I mean, it proved itself. And it also proves a point which dovetails with Bitcoin, which is at the end of the day, especially today with shipping, with air travel, with digital communication, instantaneous, the world really wants one. Now, the fact that we have almost as many monies as we have sovereign nations is a political arrangement. I would say that's not an economic or market arrangement. I would say that's something that politicians have imposed. But when they can impose that, like Zimbabwe, for example, there's some fascinating stories about it, how if you go to Zimbabwe, they just gave up and said, we're going to use the dollar. And so shopkeepers, I'm told, in Zimbabwe are remarkably adept at calculating all kinds of exchange rates between all different kinds of currencies in their heads. Now, you might come off on a little bit worse side of that exchange in terms of your change, but at any rate, and the shopkeepers in Turkey are as well. I mean, they're, if you pull out some euro or some dollars, a shopkeeper in Turkey is not going to turn you down.
Right.
He or she is going to accept that. But so in a sense, the world wants one currency, and a world of global trade definitely wants one currency. And gold was that. Gold was for the world, to a lesser extent silver, but primarily gold. And so I think there's a really important lesson there. And I would love to go back to a classical gold standard. There's very little I would seek more for the health of America. I think the destruction of the dollar is ultimately the end of all of this and our material well-being, and the world my teenagers are going to inhabit, or maybe their kids, I don't know. But I view gold as a remarkable story, because for 5,000 years, it's basically never gone to zero. Which means there's never a time when grandpa died and left you some gold that you were like, oh man, just some gold. I mean, it was like, hey, great, this is worth a lot, as opposed to, there's lots of times when grandpa died with some stock certificates in some company that's out of, for example. So it's never gone to zero. And even since 1971, I was listening to a podcast with Tom Luongo, if you know that name, and our friend Caitlin in Wyoming, the head of Custodia Bank, Caitlin Long. Yeah. And Caitlin made, I thought, an interesting point. She said, the whole point of gold, the whole purpose was to act as a tether on debt, on national debt. In other words, you were able to redeem your paper currency for gold. Therefore, that put restraints on government spending. And she said, once that last tether was gone, first in the 30s for individuals and then in 1971 for foreign governments and central banks, once that tether was gone, gold lost its reason to be.
Right.
And so if that's true, we would think that its price would have fallen since over 50 years now, since 1971, to basically just industrial and jewelry use. Maybe $100 an ounce, $200 an ounce, I don't know, something like that. But the fact that it still hovers around 2000 is because in people's mind, whether those are central banks buying it up, which they certainly are, national treasuries, or just big companies and individuals who hold it secretly, is that deep down, they still think it has some sort of money, some sort of quality that gives it value above and beyond just its industrial and jewelry uses, which I would argue are nowhere near 19 or $100 an ounce. So there's just something about it. And, I want to sound mystical or something like that, but markets are what they are. Yeah. And markets have never sent gold to zero in thousands of years. So that's an incredible story. And if Bitcoin is going to knock gold off its perch, its historical perch, not its current use perch, I think Bitcoiners have to consider that that's heavy lifting.
Definitely. The multi-century head start gold has and the established track record is certainly unrivaled as far as I can tell. And one of the main qualities of gold is that it has a very inflexible supply. So it's been a very reliable store of value over time, right? What the common trope people typically throw out as a fine man's suit has cost 1 ounce of gold for, hundreds of years. There's other examples. So it maintains its purchasing power. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, looking at fiat currency, which is in many ways kind of the opposite of gold, right? It solved the portability problem, especially when it's electronic or digital. It can just be beamed around the world super fast, but it's not anchored into economic reality in any way. So it can be produced ad infinitum. It has essentially zero scarcity. Not at any one point, but in the long run, they all tend to fail due to excess production. What are your views on fiat as money? Are there advantages to it? There's some obvious disadvantages, which we've already touched on, but what are your views in general on fiat as money?
Well, there are huge advantages to the political class,
right?
Because they can produce it either in a direct way through fiscal policy or roundabout way through monetizing debt on the monetary side. And they can do all kinds of stuff with it. And a lot of times the price for doing that stuff is paid, a decade or two or even generations down the road. And so they benefit from buying votes in effect. So absolutely, fighting wars, there's all kinds of political benefits to fiat for the political class. For us, the turf for the gang members, it's all downside. It's a terrible curse. And even though as Americans, we have enjoyed what the French finance minister called our exorbitant privilege, because the dollar is the world's reserve currency and we can export inflation effectively. We send them these depreciating dollars and the Chinese send us actual stuff. Like you roll into Walmart, which is like great cheap stuff everywhere. I mean, it's fantastic for us. But at the end of the day, it's bad for our soul. I think it erodes us as a country. It gives us a false sense of reality and a false sense of wealth. It gives us a false sense of our productivity, I believe, as a nation. It lulls us into thinking that we're bigger and badder than we are. So, it's like giving more alcohol to a drunk. It makes him feel better, but are you actually doing him a favor? So there's tremendous downsides to political money. And as I mentioned earlier, the world wants one money, and the money it's got is the US dollar. I mean, that's everywhere, between the SWIFT system, between OPEC, between international settlements, between so much of international debt is denominated in dollars. I mean, the dollar really is a beast, and it's been great for Americans in that fun way, but it's in that in the long run, it's made us softer and weaker. And I think it's hollowed us out from within, because instead of having to sort of build new wealth every generation and accumulate it and hopefully don't spend it all and leave some to the next generation, we've had this sense of living large without having to work as hard as we otherwise would. So it's, it's seductive. You can see the seductive power because, look, people like me have been saying since 1971 that this is all going to blow up. We've been wrong for 50 years. It hasn't blown up. And so, when Paul Krugman says, yes, 32 million, governments aren't families. They don't have household budgets. The U.S. debt is meaningless. Boy, oh boy, you can see why a lot of normies would nod along to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. The alcohol analogy is very apt because it is inducing a dependency, right? And in the same way the alcoholic is dependent on the alcohol, we become very dependent on foreign production, right? We've eviscerated our industrial base in the U.S., and now we're very dependent on, the output of China and other countries to just really get by and enjoy our standard of living. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, iCoin Technology. iCoin has just released a sleek new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone with a little touch screen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, no GPS. It's a strictly physically cold hardware wallet. Like I said, it's got a high-res 3-inch touchscreen. It's got a camera for air gapping the wallet. It's got optional Bluetooth compatibility. And it's really a brand new UI, UX experience for a hardware wallet, making it very accessible, easy to use, not intimidating. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like iCoin Wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. Go to iCointechnology.com today and use promo code Bitcoin23 for 30% off of this new sleek hardware wallet. Okay, and then if we look at Bitcoin as money, it's sort of, in my view, it's kind of combined the useful properties of gold, and that it has this, has an absolutely inflexible supply. So it's very good at expressing or storing value over time, but it's also a digitally native instrument. So it's very easy to move across space. So solving the portability problem by effectively dematerializing gold. What are your views on Bitcoin as money?
Well, I'm hopeful for it. My CEO and founder of Monetary Metals, Keith Weiner, is a Bitcoin critic. He's presented some what I believe are novel arguments against it that I haven't heard from other people. He debated Pierre Rochard. You probably know him.
Yep.
A few years ago at the Mises Institute for a Soho Forum debate with Gene Epstein on this very topic. And so he presents some of those arguments there. But to me, it's not up to me or Keith Weiner or Pierre or the most hardcore Bitcoin maxi to say whether Bitcoin is money. That's up to the market.
Yep.
To date, its price volatility probably makes it a far less than ideal currency, for purchases, because on the shopkeeper's end, he can know the instant price. If you're a Starbucks and you're selling a sandwich sandwiches at Starbucks used to be $5. It's like 12 now. But whatever they are, if you're getting 12 in Bitcoin and then that's going to, fluctuate rapidly in a week or something, that might not be ideal for the Starbucks owner. And also the fact that there is a learning curve, to get up to speed. And especially since you need to have cold storage, you need to have your keys. You can't just be lazy and have it on an exchange. So that goes to adoption, and that goes to network effects. Those are going to be slow on the uptake, which affects it, and also the inability to some people would argue, and even Rothbard to an extent said, the money supply shouldn't be fixed. Saying saying it's got a hard cap on it is not necessarily what the market would say. Obviously, we view Bitcoin's hardness as a upside. And you mentioned gold mining earlier. I mean, even when the gold price goes way up and miners go into hyperdrive to try to make money, it's very difficult to increase the gold supply more than 2-3% in a given calendar year. I mean, most gold is already here. And with Bitcoin, we know that mining becomes even more difficult and then ultimately impossible in the coming years. So the hardness it's a virtue. It could be a bug. And the ability to run a finance system, right? If a currency is really, really fixed in supply and, as long as we're not at that fixed supply rate yet, if the maxis are correct and it's going to be going up and up in value, then people are going to be reticent to use it for finance, right? I mean, it's just like, well, why would I lend this? I just want to keep it, or buy more of it. I'm not going to worry about using it as a financial instrument. It's an investment. And so that takes away a little bit from its moneyness quality. I mean, I'm a fan because the desire to separate money from state is so incredibly noble. I don't know who Satoshi is. I know someone who knows or claims to know 100%. The simplicity of it. What is the white paper is 11 pages or something?
Yeah, 9 or 11. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's very noble. I don't think it was a CIA creation or something like that. Of course, I could be wrong. And it's such an important impulse. And Hayek had that great quote where he said, maybe something will come along to replace Fiat, but it'll sort of be on the slide. And it'll just happen off to the side and governments won't really notice. And then all of a sudden it'll be in front of us and adopted. So that maybe that'll turn out to be quite a prediction on Hayek's point. But we're not there yet. And I think the better maxis, there are scummy, slimy people in crypto, but even in Bitcoin, there are some get-rich-quick types. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but there is something wrong with it when you're talking up a book or trying to scam people or, doing weird things with Bitcoin like Sam Bankman-Fried. But the good maxis, the maxis who understand Austrian economics, they understand that this is a multi-decade experiment.
Yeah.
This is long-term. They're thinking about their grandkids. Yeah. And so I would have to say that I don't know whether Pierre's right or Keith Weiner's right. We need a crystal ball for that, but I love Bitcoin conceptually and I hope for it.
Yeah. A lot of great points there. And then, one other question. So you mentioned earlier, the Mises regression theorem that, a money needs to be demanded as a commodity or for some industrial use prior to becoming demanded as a medium of exchange or as a money. And there's kind of an outstanding debate about whether or not Bitcoin fits the Mises regression theorem. Is that kind of a moot point now that Bitcoin has an established market cap and it's only really useful as money? Does it make that entire debate kind of moot, I guess, or even theoretical? And the practicality of it is, well, Bitcoin exists and Bitcoin has a market cap, or do you think that's still a relevant debate?
It's moot. I mean, we only have to go back a little over a decade to the origins of Bitcoin, so we can, we don't have to go back into the mists of time or something. We can just go back in our lifetimes. And I would say both the encryption of it, the math of it, the novelty of it at the outset, the tech, the tech itself, the blockchain, with all of those things arguably could be the source of that pre-existing use or pre-existing value. So, I mean, I think you're right. It's established enough now where that's a theoretical and abstract discussion by Mises. very much so. I mean, you could go back to the earliest uses of gold, and you'd have to really be going back in history and relying on historical documents or history books or something. And so you wouldn't know for sure. And I would say the same thing is true of Bitcoin. We don't have to know. The market is the market. And we're very lucky to live in a time where we can watch this, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely agree with that. It's fascinating. You mentioned Hayek, the sly roundabout way that we might take money out of the hands of government. I think Milton Friedman maybe predicted something in the early days of the internet that we needed a digital cash to really get the internet, to realize its full potential. So there's been, Henry Ford, they talked about an energy currency back in the 20s, I think. So there have been these sort of pseudo predictions that something like Bitcoin might emerge one day, but it is very exciting to be alive and see it happening. You've been hosting some Twitter spaces and having some discussions about this recently. The idea of the US dollar supremacy coming to an end. Are we seeing that happen right now in your estimation? And what shape do you think that takes, if so?
Well, I think we're in the very early stages of it, and it could be another 50 years. I mean, never underestimate the power of fiat and the power of guns and armies, nukes. But if it happens, if de-dollarization happens, it'll be because we, the U.S., did it to ourselves. It won't be because of the BRICS or anybody else. It'll be because we went so wild with our spending. We were so profligate. We saw this Fitch downgrading our credit rating just yesterday. And at some point, the rest of the world is going to look at the United States of America and say, these people are never going to get their fiscal house in order. And if they're going to sell me government debt, I want junk bond rates. I don't want this 3% crap. I want 20%. And so that day could come. But I don't believe in de-dollarization in the near term. I am an adherent of Brent Johnson's I think inaptly named dollar milkshake theory. I think it should be dollar vacuum theory, which is basically as other countries get in trouble, they actually demand more dollars, not less. You can just look up dollar milkshake theory. There's some great YouTubes on it. And I want to credit Brent Johnson at Santiago Capital for coming up with it. But I just think the world is a little too dependent on dollars and our payment systems at present. And let's not forget, the BRICS countries, like every other country, not only their central banks have gold, well, I think the Russians have primarily treasuries, or I might be getting that backwards. But, they have lots of dollars too in their fiscal treasuries. So while is it sort of geopolitical grinding game, we can call it currency wars, as Jim Rickards coined, in that long-term grinding game, of course, Russia and China would like to see the U.S. dollar dethroned. Well, why wouldn't they? For all the aforementioned reasons about it's an imperial tool. They'd like to see it dethroned, just like they'd like to see our latest, aircraft carrier not go into reverse or something. But at the same time, in the short term, they would be hurt tremendously if the dollar had a precipitous crash, because they've got lots of them. So it's like musical chairs, and they have lots of treasuries. So it's like musical chairs. Nobody wants to be last. Everyone would want to be first when this alleged dollar dump begins to happen. So I just don't think that's in the near term. But you know what? That's so far beyond my pay grade. If you were in Washington, D.C. or in Moscow in 1985, and you went around saying, this Soviet Union is just going to collapse by about 1989. It's just going to collapse of its own weight. You would have been absolutely laughed out of town. So, you ever heard the expression, slowly, then all at once?
Yeah, gradually, then suddenly.
Yeah, I think that'll be the dollar's fate ultimately. But I mean, I'm happy to discuss the BRICS idea more, but I don't see it as not.
Yeah, I agree with you. Actually, I think Brent's theory is sound. Like you mentioned it earlier, Zimbabwe, right? They just give up and they dollarize. Because we have this exorbitant privilege, it stands to reason that the US dollar would be among the last fiat currencies standing. Given our geopolitical presence and its established position, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, I do want to ask you, actually, that was my next question. BRICS countries have introduced this idea of a gold-backed, or it's a proposal rather, of a gold-backed currency. What impact do you think that could have on the existing geopolitical order and the US dollar?
Well, it's an interesting idea to float. I don't know that they've announced it. The media's announced it. It's not so clear whether they've actually announced it because, first of all, it was a Russian embassy in Africa made this announcement, and then some media outlets picked it up, and then some people really ran with it, like Alistair McLeod, who's on Twitter and has written a couple of really good lengthy articles about how it could work mechanically. He's very knowledgeable about that, and I recommend that. But India has denied it. Russia and China have said, well, it's not on the agenda at our August meeting, which is interesting, by the way, because theoretically, if Vladimir Putin was to attend that meeting in South Africa, he could be arrested because South Africa happens to be a signatory to the International Criminal Court, which has a warrant out for Mr. Putin's arrest. So the idea, I suppose, is that he won't attend. But supposedly it's not on the agenda. Maybe it is on the agenda. But these are the little tremors, just like the Fitch credit rating downgrade. Yes, I guess yesterday as we record this. These little tremors could add up to a big earthquake. And so, again, it's in their long-term interest to dethrone the dollar. It's not in their short-term interest. But what they're really talking about, I think, is a trading currency, a settlement currency between nations and their central banks, not a currency that individuals within those nations or outside those nations would use, and not a currency that's redeemable individually. It would be simply, each country would have its own gold reserves in its central bank. Those gold reserves might not even move physically to any sort of centralized thing because within the BRICS, they might not trust each other so much. So that gold would just sit there, safe at home, but it would be pledged to this trading currency idea. And then they would be able to use this to settle things between themselves and then mark as an accounting ledger who owns what gold. But at some point, I don't know, if you're an international investor or trader or a currency person, do you really trust Xi? Do you really trust the Russians? Do you really trust the Indians to run a stable currency, a solid currency when we say backed by gold, what that means is that it's redeemable, at least at the national level. Again, maybe not the individual. And that's a hard thing to do. That means you can't spend too much. Governments like to spend. So it would impose a measure of fiscal discipline on those countries, which is very hard to imagine. I mean, China's central bank went absolutely nuts since about Greenspan's. And they built all these empty ghost city skyscrapers. I mean, their central bank makes ours look conservative. So, where are these governments going to find this newfound? Look at Brazil. I mean, Lula's openly praising communism. Where are they going to find this this austerity? So you gotta mark me down as in the highly dubious category.
Yeah, great points there. Just to speak to the credit downgrade that we mentioned, we're recording this on August 2nd, 2023, and I believe it was announced yesterday or the day before, August 1st, that the U.S. credit rating was downgraded from AAA to AA minus, I believe is correct. And this is I guess a product of our debt, right? Basically, right? We've just accumulated too much debt, so our credit rating has been reduced. Okay, one last question in the money domain, and then maybe we can talk about some other things. You've advocated for scrapping AML KYC laws. These are anti-money laundering and know your customer laws. You stated that this is like an excessive compliance requirement that gums up the system and creates unnecessary friction. Can you expand a bit on what that is? I think a lot of people don't even know what AML and KYC is, much less the impact it has on financial flows worldwide.
Yeah. Well, you got to understand, part of my job is being a compliance lawyer for AML and KYC stuff. We do deals using physical gold around the world in a lot of different jurisdictions, and sometimes we have to account for the source of the gold. And right now, there are sanctions against using Russian gold, and gold's fungible. You can melt it down and take off a little Russian stamp or whatever. So I'm sort of knee deep in this. And so AML stands for money laundering. KYC stands for know your customer. These really came out of 1986 or 1987 Paris summit, where a group of G7 nations created the Financial Action Task Force. And so this is an international approach to supposedly protecting us from drug dealers, trafficking and all this, that. They always, it's about the children, Robert.
Always for our protection.
It's always about control. It's always about capital controls. And, to me, governments have no business knowing about our money and what we're doing with it, where we're transporting it. Switzerland lost its whole status as I don't want to say bank secrecy, I would say bank privacy. They used to not cooperate with foreign governments who asked questions. You could have a bank account in Switzerland. That was your business. You could walk into a Swiss bank with a suitcase full of cash, deposit it, and that was that. It was yours. And this presumption of criminality goes against everything that the Western world claims to stand for, from Magna Carta forward. Mm-hmm. And I resent the hell out of it. I think capital controls are the precursor to, fences with barbed wire on top of them, camps. Mm-hmm. We'd be a little hyperbolic here. I think money and privacy are part of human nature, and we shouldn't have to answer to governments about what we're doing with our money. So this idea that we have to stop illicit criminal activity, but that's fine, but that's a criminal matter. Let the authorities go after criminals who are doing things that you and I would hopefully consider real crimes, victim crimes, force and fraud. Mm-hmm. But don't put that on third parties like Monetary Metals to assess the provenance of an investor's, money, his or her ability to make a deposit with us and get involved in our, become a customer of ours. That's, to me, that's just wildly authoritarian. And it's funny that progressives and globalists are so for this, because it really goes against this sort of unbound world that they claim to promote. In fact, a lot of people who are for open borders, which I am not, a lot of people who are for open borders are actually, believe in KYC and AML. It strikes me as like, so open borders for people, but not money and, digital bank wires. And if you just look back at human history, I mean, my gosh, there's 2 world wars, which are recent history. Some families got out of places with gold, maybe in a suitcase, or with some physical jewelry on their person, form of a necklace or something. And when they arrived, maybe in America or wherever, that was their, first month's rent. I mean, I really hate the idea of capital controls.
Yeah.
And information itself, even if you have nothing to hide, just having to provide information, but not being actually prohibited from moving that, let's say that money across the border. The information itself, I would view as a form of capital. It just goes against everything I believe in. So it's really part of the noose that has been tightening in this country, especially enhanced by 9/11, Patriot Act, all that stuff that came after that. And it's a real infringement on sovereignty too, because there ought to be a country out there that can say, F you, I'm not doing this.
Right.
And there are a few, but they basically become international scofflaws and suffer as a result.
Yeah, it's a great point, because it ultimately is a violation of privacy, right? Which is the freedom to selectively reveal or conceal oneself or one's information. And so this forced revealing of financial information is very anti-freedom, anti-privacy, and just, it's antithetical to the principles of the West, as you've said. So I agree strongly on that front. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Wasabi Wallet. With Wasabi Wallet, you can receive, send, and store Bitcoin privately. In Wasabi Wallet, your transaction history and wallet balance are completely hidden. Wasabi Wallet is easy to use, all of its privacy features are built in by default, and it works with any amount of Bitcoin. Wasabi users can make CoinJoin transactions together with BTC Pay server users or Trezor Suite users. For BTC Pay server users, they can make payments directly inside of a CoinJoin, and for Trezor Suite users, you can make CoinJoins directly on a hardware wallet. These features result in fee savings and security improvements for both sets of users. So go to wasabiwallet.io today to download the state-of-the-art Bitcoin privacy wallet. Now I'd like to tell you about our sponsor, Casa. Casa makes it simple to buy and secure your Bitcoin without wondering whether you're doing it right. Specifically, Casa provides a multi-key custody solution, which is by far the most secure way to custody your Bitcoin. Now, when I talk about Bitcoin being theft-proof money or inviolable private property, a multi-key custody model is exactly what I am talking about. Using multiple keys lets you maintain full control of your Bitcoin while also giving you redundancy in case you lose one of the keys. It's also the best way to secure your Bitcoin for inheritance planning purposes. So go to keys.casa, that's C-A-S-A, today to sign up and use discount code BREEDLOVE. Okay, shifting out of the money domain a little bit, you recently said that democracy is a threat to free speech. I think this was in regard to a retweet by something RFK had said. And after reading Hoppe, specifically his book, Democracy, the God That Failed, I'm actually in strong agreement with you that democracy is deeply flawed. But to say that in 2023 flies in the face of common sense, that democracy is somehow this ultimate governance structure that we've decided. But there's many, there's trade-offs, right? There's advantages and disadvantages. So could you just expand a bit on the ways in which democracy is a threat to free speech? Because I think that's a difficult pill for many people to swallow.
Well, political democracy has proven itself in the 20th and now 21st century as debacle, as far as I'm concerned. Freedom. Go back to Woodrow Wilson. You mentioned World War I, central banks. And true democracy is expressed every day in the marketplace. When we talked about the world wants one money, that's democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What's democratic is everywhere you go on earth, there's Diet Coke.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
right.
That's people expressing choice in a voluntary manner.
Mm-hmm.
That the marketplace, as regulated as it may be, is the real democratic mechanism side. But political democracy, that tweet, if I recall, was in reference to RFK Jr. being dopey. I mean, God bless the guy; he's a baby. But just this dopey thing. And what had happened is some horrible woman on a House committee that had been called by the Republicans as a dog and pony show to talk about censorship. Republicans would be happy to censor. Some Democratic woman who'd been giving her talking points by the DNC, RFK bad, basically said you shouldn't be allowed to talk, and we because of your anti-Semitic remarks, you shouldn't be allowed to even be at this hearing. And so he tweeted about this, and I just thought to myself, well, democracy is what put that horrible woman in her seat, right? I mean, she's the one. So if 51% vote to shut off RFK Jr., then that's that, but people don't use democracy in the way that us, sort of jaded libertarians do, that it's just majority force. They use this as sort of happy catch-all phrase for legitimate. Democratic system or democratic government is legitimate because, well, why is it legitimate? Well, because people vote. Well, why does that make it legitimate? Well, because they consent. So consent is the linchpin of legitimacy. And somehow in people's muddled minds, this all gets mixed up with democracy. And so people just throw the word out there all the time, like as a synonym for good or legitimate. I think that's what dopey RFK Jr.'s doing. And I like the guy. I don't mean to be hard on. So it just struck me as silly. I mean, what democracy does is it encourages high time preference and encourages politicians to do things now, spend now at the expense of tomorrow. Look at Social Security, passed in the 30s. It's now almost 100 years on that we have these huge entitlement fiscal gaps going forward, where the number of old people is going to wildly outpace the number of younger people, and the whole system is going to be completely bankrupt. But the people who voted for that are long dead. Right? That's democracy in action. Thanks. They offloaded their problems onto us 80, 90 years hence. So it is interesting how people are all for democracy unless and until the wrong guy wins, like Trump. Then all of a sudden, no. That's not democracy. Trump's a threat to our democracy. Why is that? Well, because the Russians interfered. It's like, well, if voting is so fragile that a few Facebook ads or something paid for by the Kremlin, which I doubt happens, is enough to sway things, then, why is it such a great system? Why are you lauding? The other thing is, let's say, let's just say we didn't have the electoral college and we had a pure majority vote on president. And let's say arguably, I don't know the facts because it's state by state and I wasn't there, but let's say arguably Hillary Clinton got more raw votes than Donald Trump in 2016. And that we had pure democracy, direct voting, no electoral college. Hillary would have been installed, and everyone, all the left would be saying, see, at the end of the day, democracy works, and the people were too smart for this crazy orange man with the reality TV show, and they knew Hillary Clinton with all of her experience as Secretary of State or whatever senator, that she was the wise choice. And so in the long run, democracy is great. But just switch a couple of million votes the other way to Trump. All of a sudden, this is, an absolute calamity, an existential crisis for the whole country, based on just 1 million or 2 million votes, less than 1% of the population, 330 million. What the hell kind of system is that?
Right.
I mean, that sounds incredibly fragile. So even if you really are for democracy in the most direct way possible, national popular vote, it's still incredibly easy to attack conceptually. It's a terrible system. It's anti-property because people can vote away other people's property.
Right.
And at the end of the day, property and life are bound up together. They cannot be separated in any meaningful way. Every human being comes into this earth, and right now, you and I have to either stand or sit on a piece of ground. We have to exist in physical, corporeal space. And we have to have some clothes on our back, presumably. We have to have some calories today, presumably. You don't have to, but you have to have some water. I mean, and then you go out in concentric circles from that with electricity, hot and cold running water, all forms of energy, transport, it's just endless. And so you can't separate human beings from property And this isn't materialism per se. This is reality. This is just, we need property. And so, any system that puts property at risk like that is a system that I'm just not interested in. And I think we should attack it at every stage. We should make people question it at every stage. We should remind people that the term doesn't appear, the term democracy doesn't appear in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights.
Right.
And, it's just another way we've ceded language and we've ceded ground to progressives of both parties. And when we give lip service to democracy, I don't care about democracy, and no one should. And at the end of the day, RFK does. He just says he does. They all say that until the wrong person wins.
Yeah, that's excellently said. And yeah, it's a point that I'm amazed more people don't know is, the United States was founded as a constitutional republic, not a democracy. I don't know how we got hypnotized into thinking that we're a democracy out of the gate. And I really think a good framing, you put many good framings there on democracy. I think another useful one is just the tyranny of the majority, right? So if consent is the linchpin to freedom, mutual voluntary exchange and these things, but that's not what democracy is, because if you have 51% deciding, well, then you've got non-consensual 49% sort of being pulled into that canopy, and it doesn't make sense. And to your point on the market being like an actual pure democracy, it reminded me of that great point in the Ethics of Money Production. I don't remember the author he cited, but he was talking about 1 penny being 1 market vote. Like how we spend our money is the actual democracy. That's why we have Diet Coke all over the world, as you said. So in a way, central banking and democracy, where to the extent they're creating these non-consensual exchanges, they're kind of a form of voter fraud in a way, and that they're distorting what the market would actually manifest absent the violation of property. So yeah, it all comes down to property. I like how you said that you can't separate life and property, because the things we create are an extension of ourselves, and it's what allows us to live and flourish and, be civilized. So any system that attacks property, I think, really needs to be attacked ideologically. Okay, I've kept you long enough. I would like to ask you one last question if you got just a couple more minutes.
I'm happy to stay on.
You recently tweeted, and I thought this was a cryptic tweet, but interesting. So I'm hoping you can expand upon it. You said that politics and statism impose unchosen hierarchies. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah, cryptic is my way of, too clever by half. I just mean we have the wrong elites, right? The elites we have in society are, in my opinion, are not the elites we would have in a more market-based, meritocracy, for lack of a better term. I know that's used by some of the Francis Fukuyama types, and I don't like that. But, I think elite rule is inevitable. I think Michael Malice is famous for that line. Elite rule is absolutely inevitable. There's going to be basically oligarchs in any system. I mean, if you go to a prison, if you have the misfortune to be assigned to prison, there's going to be sort of an oligarchy within prison running things, both with the guards and the inmates. If you go in a social setting, it's Pareto distribution.
Yeah.
Just applies in the world. And so in any society, there are going to be elites, and they are probably going to have more power over the politics and the money and the banking and the culture and all kinds of things than you do. Well, unless you work your way into that elite status or be born into it. That's another nice way. Mm-hmm. But so that's inevitable. To me, what matters is how are average people allowed to live in society? Are they actually able to get ahead with sound money? Are they, relatively free in terms of their, personal lives, their business lives? Do the elites hate their guts? And in America, the elites very much hate our guts and wish us ill.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They'd like us to not be eating meat, not be driving cars, all kinds of things. And if you're voting for Trump, they'd like you to be not voting. And if you're showing up outside the Capitol for a protest on January 6th, they'd like you to be cooling your heels in one of those prisons for a long time. So we should be open about that, I think, and honest. So we've got the wrong elites, and I think that Hoppe makes the point in democracy that, well, say what you want about monarchs, but their fortunes, oftentimes a monarchical family was hereditary. Their fortunes are more tied to the average people, because if they bankrupt the country through wars, for example, if they overtax and face a popular revolt or an assassination, that sort of thing, monarchs of old, when we think of them as these absolute powers, in many ways faced more accountability than these crappy Democratic politicians today. I mean, nobody's assassinating Nancy Pelosi. You're not going to get close to Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is going to go off to her grave untouched. She's going to be rich, elite. She will never pay in any sense, even, psychic, for her vast, Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush will go off into that gentle night like a comfy teddy bear, never with the slightest accountability for murdering a million Iraqis, in effect, or ordering a war that resulted. So this idea that monarchs were these absolute iron-fisted rulers relative to the so-called, Democratic politicians of today, Macron, Tony Blair, what's her name in Germany? No longer there.
Merkel.
I just don't think that's true. And so what we need is almost sort of like a marketplace elite, like not a monarchy, but natural elites who have, by their very nature, by their intelligence, by their ability, by their touch and concern for average people, that people naturally gravitate towards them and view them as elites. And we don't have that with our current crowd at all. And, we're suffering as a result of it, I think.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I guess, we are hierarchical animals, so that seems unavoidable. And I guess ideally we'd have some type of maybe an entrepreneurial elite, at least someone that's rendering useful goods and services to the human species in their ascent to the top of the hierarchy, versus these extractive political actors. Like, they're not creating any value at all. They're just stealing, literally. So yeah, that is definitely an ideal, I guess, we could work towards. Jeff, I really appreciate you having this conversation with me. I love digging into these abstract topics, learning, and hopefully helping people think about the world a little bit differently. And I think you do a great job of explaining these concepts in a way that people can digest. So thank you for that. Where can people find you on the internet?
Basically on Twitter at Jeff Deist, all one word, JEFFDEIST.
Awesome. Jeff, thank you so much.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thank you, Robert.